There is a scream that echoes through Adventure Time, a sound so distinctive and unsettling that it has become a meme, a punchline, a thing people imitate without understanding what it means. Lemongrab screams because he cannot do anything else. He screams because the world is too much, because sensation overwhelms him, because he was brought into existence without the tools to process that existence. His scream is not comedy, though the show often frames it that way. His scream is the sound of a being in constant crisis, unable to regulate himself, unable to find peace, unable to understand why everything feels like assault. To understand Lemongrab is to understand that scream not as joke but as tragedy, as the inevitable expression of a consciousness that was made wrong and then abandoned to figure out wrongness alone. Princess Bubblegum created Lemongrab in her laboratory, as she has created so many beings, bringing consciousness into existence through science that functions like magic. But something went wrong in Lemongrab's creation. The show never specifies exactly what, never provides a technical explanation for his condition. It simply presents him as he is: hypersensitive, rigid, unable to tolerate ambiguity, prone to explosive reactions, fundamentally incapable of the easy social functioning that other candy people display. He came out of the laboratory screaming, and in some sense, he has never stopped, even when his mouth is closed. The scream is internal, constant, the background noise of an existence that was broken from its first moment. The question the show raises through Lemongrab is one of the most profound questions any creator can face. What do you owe a being you have made, especially when you have made them badly? Bubblegum's response to this question is the source of much of Lemongrab's suffering. She did not destroy him, which might have been mercy. She did not keep him close and care for him, which might have been love. She did not try to fix him, which might have been responsibility. Instead, she gave him a castle and sent him away, created distance between herself and the problem she had created, hoped perhaps that isolation would somehow resolve what her science had failed to resolve. This abandonment is the second wound Lemongrab carries, layered on top of the first wound of his broken creation. He was made wrong, and then he was rejected for being wrong. The ethics of creation run through Adventure Time as a persistent theme, but nowhere are they more starkly presented than in Lemongrab's story. Bubblegum creates constantly, brings beings into existence with apparent ease, populates her kingdom with candy people whose consciousness she has generated. Most of these creations turn out fine, functional beings capable of happiness and relationship and meaningful existence. But Lemongrab demonstrates that creation is a gamble, that consciousness once generated cannot be ungifted, that a creator who makes a being capable of suffering has made a being who will suffer. Bubblegum played God and lost, and Lemongrab is the one who pays the price for her loss, carrying the burden of an existence he did not ask for and cannot escape. The philosophical tradition has long grappled with the ethics of bringing beings into existence, though usually in the context of biological reproduction rather than scientific creation. The antinatalist argument holds that bringing a being into existence is always a harm because existence inevitably contains suffering, and the being cannot consent to that suffering before they exist to be asked. Lemongrab is this argument made flesh, a being who suffers from his first moment, who never asked to exist, who might well prefer non-existence if he could conceptualize the alternative. Bubblegum did not ask his permission because she could not. She created him and hoped for the best, and the best did not happen, and now a conscious being exists who experiences existence as constant assault. This is not to say that Bubblegum is a villain for creating Lemongrab. The show is more nuanced than that. Creation is what Bubblegum does, how she expresses herself, how she builds the kingdom she believes in. She could not know in advance that Lemongrab would emerge as he did, could not predict that this particular creation would suffer where others thrived. Her culpability lies not in the creation itself, but in the aftermath, in how she responded when it became clear that something had gone wrong. A responsible creator would have stayed, would have tried to help, would have accepted the burden of caring for a being she had made. Bubblegum instead retreated, created distance, transformed a problem of relationship into a problem of geography. Out of sight, out of mind, except that Lemongrab remains in his own sight, in his own mind, unable to escape himself the way Bubblegum escaped him. The show uses Lemongrab to ask questions that most children's entertainment avoids entirely. What happens when creation fails? What do we owe the beings we bring into existence? Is consciousness itself a gift or a burden when that consciousness is structured for suffering? These questions have no easy answers, and the show does not pretend otherwise. It simply presents Lemongrab in all his difficulty, allows us to see his pain even when we are laughing at his absurdity, invites us to consider what it might mean to exist as he exists. The word unacceptable becomes Lemongrab's catchphrase, his most recognizable utterance, the thing he screams at a world that constantly violates his expectations. But the word carries deeper resonance than its comedic usage suggests. Lemongrab finds everything unacceptable because everything is, for him, genuinely intolerable. The sensory input that others filter automatically overwhelms him. The social situations that others navigate intuitively confuse and frighten him. The ambiguities that others accept as normal feel to him like chaos, like disorder, like threats to the fragile stability he desperately needs. When he screams that something is unacceptable, he is not being entitled or difficult. He is accurately describing his experience of a world that was not built for minds like his. The tragedy deepens when we recognize that Lemongrab did not choose his sensitivity, did not select his rigidity, did not opt into the neurology that makes existence so difficult for him. He was made this way, constructed with these particular features, brought into being with a consciousness that would find being itself unbearable. His suffering is not punishment for wrongdoing or consequence of bad choices. It is simply what it feels like to be him, the baseline experience of existing as Lemongrab in a world designed for other kinds of beings. The show asks us to sit with this tragedy, to recognize its weight, to understand that some suffering has no justification and serves no purpose, and simply is. There is something almost unbearable about watching Lemongrab in his early appearances, before the show fully developed his character, when he was presented primarily as antagonist and absurdity. We laugh at him because the show invites us to laugh, because his screaming is exaggerated and his behavior is extreme, and comedy often emerges from discomfort pushed to its limits. But underneath the comedy is a being in genuine distress, genuinely unable to cope, genuinely suffering in ways that our laughter does not acknowledge. The show's later development of Lemongrab can be read as a correction, an attempt to give depth and dignity to a character who was initially treated primarily as a joke. Whether this correction succeeds is a matter of debate, but the attempt itself suggests awareness that something important was being missed in the early comic treatment. The first episode, featuring Lemongrab, establishes the pattern that will characterize his entire arc. He arrives at the Candy Kingdom during Bubblegum's temporary absence, attempts to impose order according to his rigid understanding, fails catastrophically because his methods are incompatible with the beings he is trying to govern. He is removed, returned to his castle, relegated again to the margins. This pattern of arrival, failure, and banishment repeats throughout his appearances, each cycle deepening his isolation and confirming his sense that he does not belong anywhere, that no place will accept him, that he is destined to exist alone in a castle that is both refuge and prison. The nature of Lemongrab's wrongness is never clinically specified in the show, but the symptoms he displays map recognizably onto experiences that many viewers will find familiar. He cannot tolerate sensory input that others find normal. He needs rigid structure and becomes distressed when expectations are violated. He struggles to read social cues and responds inappropriately to situations that others navigate easily. He experiences emotions at overwhelming intensity and lacks the regulatory capacity to modulate them. He takes things literally, misses subtext, fails to understand why others react to him with confusion or fear. These are not random symptoms assembled for comedic effect. They form a coherent picture of a particular kind of mind, a neurodivergent mind, a mind that processes the world differently than the neurotypical minds around it. The show never uses clinical language to describe Lemongrab, never names his condition, never provides the kind of diagnosis that might make his experiences legible to viewers unfamiliar with neurodivergence. This absence might be read as avoidance, as the show's unwillingness to directly address the real-world conditions it seems to be depicting. But it might also be read as respect, as a refusal to reduce Lemongrab to a label, as an insistence that his experience be understood on its own terms rather than through the framework of pathology. Lemongrab is not a representation of autism or sensory processing disorder or any other named condition. He is himself, a unique being with a unique experience, even if that experience resonates with the experiences of real people who have felt similarly made wrong. The resonance is powerful for viewers who have lived in minds that do not work the way minds are supposed to work. To watch Lemongrab struggle is to see your own struggles externalized, dramatized, presented on screen with a clarity that your internal experience rarely achieves. His scream is the scream you have wanted to release when the world became too much, when sensory input overwhelmed you, when you could not understand why everyone else seemed to navigate so easily what you found so impossibly hard. His rigidity is your rigidity, the desperate need for structure and predictability that others dismiss as inflexibility or stubbornness. His loneliness is your loneliness, the isolation that comes from being fundamentally different in a world that was not built for your kind of mind. The tragedy of Lemongrab is not simply that he suffers, but that his suffering is treated as his fault, as a character flaw, rather than a condition, as something he should be able to control if only he tried harder. Bubblegum sends him away because he is difficult, because his presence disrupts the smooth functioning of her kingdom, because dealing with him requires more patience and accommodation than she is willing to provide. The other characters regard him with fear and contempt, react to his distress with annoyance rather than compassion, treat his symptoms as choices rather than involuntary expressions of a neurology he did not choose. This is the experience of neurodivergence distilled to its essence. Being punished for a condition you cannot help, being rejected for differences you did not select, being told implicitly and explicitly that the problem is you rather than the world that refuses to accommodate you. The show's willingness to sit with Lemongrab's experience, to make him a recurring character rather than a one-off joke, suggests a depth of engagement with these themes that might not be apparent on first viewing. Lemongrab appears in multiple episodes across multiple seasons, his story developing and deepening over time. We see him in different contexts, facing different challenges, responding in ways that are consistent with his established character, but that also reveal new dimensions of his experience. The show takes him seriously as a person, even when it uses him for comedy, grants him the dignity of development even as it laughs at his struggles. This mixed treatment reflects the mixed experience of neurodivergence in the real world, where you are simultaneously a person deserving of respect and a source of amusement or annoyance to those around you. The question the show ultimately raises is whether Lemongrab's wrongness is really wrongness at all, or whether it is simply difference, divergence from a norm that is itself arbitrary. Lemongrab's mind works differently than other minds. This difference causes him suffering in a world built for other kinds of minds. But the suffering is not inherent to his neurology. It is produced by the mismatch between his needs and what the world provides, between his ways of processing and the ways of processing the world expects. In a different world, one built for minds like his, Lemongrab might not suffer at all. His wrongness is contextual, relational, a product of environment as much as constitution. The show hints at this possibility without fully developing it, suggesting that Lemongrab's tragedy is not inevitable but constructed, not natural but social. The social model of disability argues that disability is not located in the individual but in the environment, that people are disabled by societies that fail to accommodate their needs rather than by their bodies or minds themselves. Lemongrab's story can be read through this lens. His suffering is produced not by his neurology alone, but by the interaction between his neurology and an environment that refuses to accommodate it. Bubblegum could have built a world that worked for Lemongrab, could have structured Castle Lemongrab in ways that met his sensory needs, could have created social systems that did not require the flexibility he lacks. Instead, she built a standard candy kingdom and expected Lemongrab to fit into it, blamed him when he could not, punished him for the mismatch she had created. This reading does not absolve Lemongrab of responsibility for his actions, particularly his later cruelty. But it does complicate the simple narrative that his problems are his own fault, that he simply needs to try harder or be better. Some problems cannot be solved through individual effort because they are not individual problems. They are structural problems, environmental problems, problems of fit between a being and the world that being must inhabit. Lemongrab's tragedy is partly his own, but partly also the tragedy of a world that had room for him, but chose not to make that room, that could have accommodated his differences, but instead demanded conformity he could not provide. The show's refusal to cure Lemongrab, to fix him, to make him normal, is significant in this context. Many narratives featuring neurodivergent characters end with those characters being normalized, their differences erased, their struggles resolved through transformation into something more acceptable. Lemongrab never becomes acceptable. He remains himself throughout the series, difficult and screaming and wrong, and the show suggests that this is not a failure, but simply a reality. Some beings are made wrong and stay wrong, and the question is not how to fix them, but how to live with them, how to build worlds that have room for wrongness, how to extend compassion to those whose existence will never be easy. The language of wrongness itself deserves examination. To say Lemongrab was made wrong implies a standard of rightness against which he fails to measure, a norm from which he deviates, a correct way of being that he does not embody. But who determines this standard? Who defines the norm? In the Adventure Time universe, the norm is set by beings like Bubblegum, by the neurotypical majority whose ways of processing become the default against which all other ways are judged. Lemongrab is wrong only relative to this particular standard. By a different standard, one that valued his particular sensitivities and needs, he might not be wrong at all. The show raises this possibility without fully endorsing it, leaving viewers to consider whether wrongness is objective or merely conventional. The experience of being told you are wrong when you cannot help being what you are is one of the most damaging experiences a person can endure. It creates shame that attaches not to behavior, which can be changed, but to being, which cannot. Lemongrab carries this shame throughout the series, the internalized message that his very existence is a mistake, that he should not be what he is, that the world would be better if he were different or absent. This shame fuels much of his destructive behavior, creates the self-hatred that eventually manifests as cruelty toward others. He treats others badly, in part because he was taught to see his own kind of being as bad, because the contempt directed at him has become the contempt he directs at the world. Lemongrab's relationship with Princess Bubblegum is the central wound of his existence, the original injury from which all other injuries flow. She made him. She is, in the only sense that matters, for a being who was created rather than born, his mother. And she abandoned him, sent him away, rejected the child she had made, because that child was not what she wanted him to be. Every interaction between them carries this weight, this primal betrayal, this fundamental failure of the parental bond. Lemongrab cannot forgive because he cannot forget, cannot move past the original wound because the wound is constitutive, makes him who he is in ways that cannot be separated from his ongoing existence. The psychological literature on maternal rejection describes patterns that map eerily onto Lemongrab's behavior. Children who experience early rejection often develop attachment difficulties, struggle to form healthy relationships, oscillate between desperate clinging and preemptive withdrawal. They may develop rigid defenses, attempt to control their environments as compensation for the uncontrollable rejection they experienced, become hypersensitive to any hint of further abandonment. Lemongrab displays all of these patterns. His authoritarianism, his desperate need for control, his inability to tolerate deviation from expectations. These are not random character traits, but predictable responses to the rejection he experienced at his most vulnerable moment, when he was newly created and utterly dependent on the being who had made him. Bubblegum's failure is not simply that she abandoned Lemongrab, but that she has never acknowledged the abandonment, never taken responsibility for the harm she caused, never attempted the repair that might allow their relationship to heal. When she interacts with Lemongrab, she treats him as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be understood. She manipulates him, deceives him, uses his condition against him when it serves her purposes. She does not hate him, exactly. She simply does not regard him as fully deserving of the moral consideration she extends to others. He is her mistake, her failed experiment, and she relates to him through that lens rather than through the lens of parenthood or even basic personhood. The show complicates this picture by making Bubblegum sympathetic in other contexts, by showing her genuine love for her kingdom and her other creations, by depicting her as a complex character with her own struggles and limitations. She is not a monster. She is simply someone who made something she could not handle and responded by creating distance rather than accepting responsibility. This is a common human failure, perhaps the most common response to our own mistakes, the desire to put space between ourselves and the evidence of our failures. Bubblegum's treatment of Lemongrab is wrong, but it is recognizably wrong, the kind of wrong that emerges from limitation rather than malice, from fear rather than hatred. Lemongrab's response to Bubblegum's rejection is to become what she implicitly told him he was: unacceptable. If he is going to be treated as a problem regardless of what he does, he might as well be a problem. If he is going to be feared and avoided regardless of his behavior, he might as well give them something to fear. This is the logic of the rejected child, the reasoning that produces the very behavior that justifies the rejection, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of dysfunction. Lemongrab becomes more rigid, more controlling, more prone to outbursts, more difficult, and each escalation confirms Bubblegum's decision to send him away, validates her choice to maintain distance, reinforces the rejection that caused the behavior in the first place. The cycle is vicious and self-perpetuating, and the show offers no easy resolution. Bubblegum does not have a redemption arc with Lemongrab, does not eventually recognize her failure and make amends. She remains distant, remains uncomfortable, remains unwilling to engage with the full weight of what she owes the being she created. Lemongrab does not heal, does not find peace, does not achieve the integration that might allow him to move beyond his original wound. Their relationship remains broken, a permanent testament to the failure of creation, to the harm that can be done when a creator does not accept responsibility for the created. The show's refusal to resolve this relationship is itself a statement, an acknowledgement that some wounds do not heal, that some failures cannot be repaired, that some damage is permanent regardless of anyone's good intentions. The power dynamic between Bubblegum and Lemongrab is fundamental to understanding their relationship. She has all the power. She made him, rules the kingdom he is technically part of, possesses the scientific knowledge that might help him, controls the resources that could make his life better. He has no power except the power to be difficult, to resist, to make his suffering visible in ways she cannot ignore. This asymmetry shapes every interaction between them. When she offers help, it comes with strings attached, with expectations of compliance, with the implicit threat that she could withdraw support at any moment. When he resists her authority, he is resisting the only being who might actually help him, destroying his best chance at support, because that support comes packaged with the very rejection that wounded him in the first place. The show suggests that Bubblegum's failure with Lemongrab is connected to her broader character flaws, to the controlling tendencies that cause problems in her other relationships as well. She wants things to be orderly, predictable, manageable. Lemongrab is none of these things. He introduces chaos into her carefully controlled world, reminds her of the limits of her power, demonstrates that even her scientific mastery cannot guarantee the outcomes she desires. Her rejection of him is partly personal failure, but partly also defensive response. The protection of her self-image as competent creator against the evidence of her incompetence that Lemongrab represents. She cannot face what she did wrong, so she removes the evidence of her wrongdoing from her sight. For viewers who have experienced parental rejection, Lemongrab's story resonates with painful familiarity. The parent who cannot handle your differences, who sends you away rather than adapting to your needs, who treats your existence as an inconvenience rather than a responsibility, these patterns recur across countless families, causing damage that echoes across lifetimes. Lemongrab is not literally anyone's child, but he functions as a representation of every child who was made to feel that their existence was a burden, that their differences were unforgivable, that they were not worth the effort of accommodation. His pain is not abstract or theoretical. It is the pain of real people, rendered in yellow skin and screaming catchphrases. The question of what Bubblegum owes Lemongrab has no clear answer within the show's narrative, but the question itself is important. Does a creator owe their creation happiness, functionality, the resources necessary to live well, the ongoing relationship that might provide those resources? Different ethical frameworks provide different answers. A utilitarian might calculate costs and benefits, conclude that Bubblegum's time is better spent on her kingdom than on her single failed creation. A deontologist might insist that creating a conscious being generates obligations that cannot be discharged through abandonment, regardless of the costs involved. The show does not adjudicate between these frameworks, but presents the situation in its complexity, allowing viewers to draw their own conclusions about responsibility and care. What seems clear is that Bubblegum's response to Lemongrab falls short of what a caring parent would provide. She does not try to understand him, does not adapt her expectations to his capabilities, does not provide the ongoing support that might help him cope with his condition. She treats him as a problem to be solved or managed, rather than as a person to be supported and loved. This failure is not unique to Bubblegum. Many real parents fail in similar ways with children whose needs exceed their capacity or willingness to provide. But the fictional context allows us to see the failure more clearly, to recognize its contours without the defensive reactions that direct accusation might provoke. The creation of Lemongrab 2 represents an attempt to solve the problem of Lemongrab through companionship, to address his loneliness by making him someone like himself. Bubblegum creates a second Lemongrab, identical in design to the first, and gives them to each other, hoping perhaps that shared experience will provide what her own care could not. The logic is not entirely wrong. Loneliness is a significant component of Lemongrab's suffering, and another being who understands his experience might provide the connection he cannot find with neurotypical others. But the solution is also an evasion, another way for Bubblegum to avoid direct responsibility, to outsource the care of her creation to another creation rather than providing that care herself. Initially, the two Lemongrabs find something like happiness together. They have each other, understand each other, share a castle and a kingdom and a way of being in the world. The early scenes of their relationship suggest genuine companionship, two beings who have found in each other what they could not find anywhere else. For viewers familiar with the experience of neurodivergent community, these scenes resonate powerfully. There is a particular relief in finding others like yourself, a particular joy in being understood without having to explain, a particular comfort in shared experience that does not require translation. The Lemongrabs have this, briefly, and the show allows us to see what it means to them. But the relationship deteriorates, and the deterioration reveals something important about the limits of sameness as a solution to isolation. The two Lemongrabs are identical, share the same sensitivities and rigidities and ways of processing the world. This sameness provides understanding but also creates conflict, because neither of them has the flexibility to accommodate the other, because their identical needs create competition rather than complementarity, because two beings who both require control cannot both have it. They begin to clash, to struggle for dominance, to enact with each other the same patterns of rejection and control that characterize Lemongrab's relationship with Bubblegum. The conflict culminates in an act of profound horror. Lemongrab eats Lemongrab 2. The scene is played for dark comedy, but its implications are deeply disturbing. Lemongrab consumes the only being who ever understood him, destroys the only relationship that ever approached equality, transforms his companion into part of himself in the most literal and violent way possible. This is cannibalism as self-destruction, the elimination of the other who is also the self, the ultimate failure of relationship. Lemongrab could not tolerate separation and could not tolerate union, could not maintain distance and could not maintain connection, and so he collapsed the distinction entirely, made the other part of himself, ended the relationship by ending the other's separate existence. The psychological interpretation of this act points toward the most damaged aspects of Lemongrab's character. He cannot share, cannot compromise, cannot allow another being to exist as genuinely other. His need for control is so total that even a being identical to himself threatens him, challenges his dominance, represents a rival claim on the world he needs to control entirely. Eating Lemongrab 2 is the ultimate act of control, the complete elimination of any challenge to his authority, the reduction of relationship to consumption. It is also, in a terrible way, an act of love, an attempt to keep Lemongrab 2 with him forever, to prevent the abandonment that he fears above all else by making separation physically impossible. The aftermath of this act transforms Lemongrab into something monstrous, his body grotesquely swollen with the absorbed mass of his other self. He becomes a tyrant, ruling his lemon people with cruelty and paranoia, creating a kingdom that reflects his internal state of chaos and distress. The show does not excuse this transformation into cruelty, does not suggest that his suffering justifies the suffering he inflicts on others. But it also does not let us forget the chain of causation that produced this monster, the sequence of abandonment and rejection and failed relationship that led from a screaming creation in Bubblegum's laboratory to a grotesque tyrant in Castle Lemongrab. Lemongrab is responsible for his actions, but he is not solely responsible for being the kind of being who would take such actions. That responsibility belongs also to his creator, to the one who made him wrong and then refused to help him live with his wrongness. The lemon people that Lemongrab creates and rules over represent yet another layer of the show's exploration of creation ethics. Like Bubblegum, Lemongrab becomes a creator, brings beings into existence, takes on the responsibility that creation entails. And like Bubblegum, he fails at this responsibility, treats his creations poorly, repeats the patterns of neglect and control that characterized his own origin. The cycle of dysfunction perpetuates itself. The abused becomes the abuser. The abandoned creates beings he will fail to properly care for. This is not destiny, but tendency, not inevitable, but predictable. The likely outcome when damage is not addressed and patterns are not interrupted. The show's willingness to make Lemongrab both sympathetic and monstrous is one of its most sophisticated narrative choices. He is not simply a victim, though he is victimized. He is not simply a villain, though he commits villainous acts. He is a complex being whose suffering has produced cruelty, whose damage has generated further damage, whose tragedy has become someone else's tragedy as well. This complexity refuses the easy morality that would either excuse his behavior because of his suffering or condemn him without acknowledging the context that produced him. Real beings are like this, simultaneously responsible for their actions, and shaped by forces beyond their control, simultaneously deserving of compassion and accountability. The resolution of Lemongrab's story, such as it is, comes through yet another act of creation. The Lemon children split him back into two beings, allowing Lemongrab and Lemongrab 2 to exist separately again. This resolution is partial at best. The new Lemongrabs are not healed, not fixed, not made acceptable. They simply continue to exist, two difficult beings, in a world that still does not quite know what to do with them. The show does not promise them happiness, or growth, or redemption. It simply allows them to persist, to continue being what they are, to exist in their wrongness, without either celebrating or condemning that wrongness. This is perhaps the most realistic outcome possible. Not cure, not transformation, but continuation. The ongoing existence of beings who will never be easy, but who deserve to exist nonetheless. The Lemon people themselves represent a kind of hope, or at least possibility. These beings created by Lemongrab are in some sense his children, the next generation of Lemon existence. They have their own difficulties, their own versions of the wrongness that characterized their creator. But they also have each other, a community of similar beings who can understand and support one another in ways that isolated Lemongrab never experienced. The Lemon society that emerges is not utopia. It has its own problems, its own conflicts, its own instances of cruelty and failure. But it is also a society, a collective existence that provides something Lemongrab never had, belonging. The possibility that community might provide what individual accommodation cannot is one of the more hopeful threads in Lemongrab's story. He suffered in isolation, surrounded by beings who did not understand him and could not meet his needs. His creations have the opportunity to build something different, a world structured around their particular kind of being rather than against it. Whether they succeed in this building is left ambiguous by the show, but the possibility itself suggests that wrongness need not mean eternal suffering, that beings made differently might create contexts where difference is not deficit. The final image we might hold of Lemongrab is not the screaming tyrant or the grotesquely swollen monster, but simply the difficult being he has always been, existing in his castle, continuing to struggle with a world that was not made for him. He has not transcended his condition. He has not been redeemed or fixed or normalized. He is simply still there, still Lemongrab, still wrong in all the ways he was wrong from the beginning. And somehow, this continuation is not defeat, but simply life, the ongoing persistence of a being who was made badly and survives anyway, who suffers and continues, who exists because he was created and has no choice but to keep existing until existence ends. The concept of the unacceptable runs through Lemongrab's existence like a thread connecting every aspect of his being. He finds things unacceptable because they genuinely are, for him, impossible to accept. The word has become his catchphrase, his defining utterance, the thing people remember and imitate when they think of him. But the comedy of his constant declarations of unacceptability obscures the truth they contain. Lemongrab lives in a world where almost everything violates his capacity to cope, where the baseline conditions of existence exceed his tolerance, where simply being alive requires navigating an endless series of assaults on his senses and his understanding. When he screams that something is unacceptable, he is not being dramatic. He is accurately reporting his experience of a world that was not designed for minds like his. The sensory dimension of Lemongrab's experience deserves particular attention because it underlies so much of his distress. He reacts to sounds and touches and situations with intensity that seems exaggerated to neurotypical observers but reflects genuine overwhelm. His nervous system processes input differently than other nervous systems, amplifying signals that others filter, creating a constant state of alert that exhausts and destabilizes. This is not a choice or a character flaw. It is neurology, the physical substrate of consciousness operating according to its own rules, rules that happen to be incompatible with comfortable existence in the world as it is structured. Lemongrab cannot simply decide to be less sensitive any more than he could decide to be less yellow. The show depicts this sensory reality through Lemongrab's reactions, his flinching and screaming and desperate attempts to control his environment. He needs things to be predictable, because unpredictability means potential assault, means sensory experiences he cannot prepare for, means the constant threat of overwhelm. His rigidity is not stubbornness, but survival strategy, the attempt to create islands of predictability in an ocean of chaos. When others violate his expectations, when they introduce novelty or ambiguity or change, they are not simply annoying him. They are threatening the fragile stability he has constructed, the careful arrangements that allow him to function at all. The tragedy is that Lemongrab's attempts to create safety through control inevitably fail and often make things worse. He cannot control other beings, cannot force the world to conform to his needs, cannot eliminate the unpredictability that threatens him. His attempts to impose order, generate resistance, create conflict, produce the very chaos he was trying to prevent. This is the trap of the controlling response to anxiety. It promises safety but delivers escalation, promises peace but creates war, promises stability but generates the instability it fears. Lemongrab is caught in this trap throughout the series, his attempts at control consistently producing outcomes worse than what he was trying to prevent. The other characters' responses to Lemongrab's sensory needs range from oblivious to actively hostile. They do not understand why he reacts as he does, interpret his distress as aggression or unreasonableness, respond to his attempts at control with defiance or mockery. This lack of understanding compounds his suffering, adds social isolation to sensory overwhelm, teaches him that his needs are not legitimate and will not be accommodated. A more compassionate response might involve adapting environments to reduce sensory assault, providing predictability where possible, recognizing his reactions as symptoms rather than choices. But the characters around Lemongrab rarely offer this compassion, and his suffering continues unaddressed. The question of accommodation is central to understanding Lemongrab's tragedy. In the real world, neurodivergent individuals often require accommodations, modifications to environment, or expectation that allow them to function despite processing differences. These accommodations are not special privileges, but basic accessibility. The recognition that one size does not fit all, that different minds require different conditions to thrive. Lemongrab receives no such accommodations. He is expected to function in a world built for other kinds of minds, blamed when he cannot, punished for failures that stem from the mismatch between his needs and what the world provides. His tragedy is partly the tragedy of unaccommodated difference, of a being left to struggle alone with challenges that might have been eased through understanding and adaptation. The show never explicitly frames Lemongrab's situation in terms of disability accommodation, never uses the language of accessibility or neurodiversity, but the framework fits. Lemongrab is disabled by his environment, prevented from functioning by conditions that could be modified, suffering unnecessarily because those modifications are not made. His creator has the power and knowledge to help him, but chooses not to, preferring distance to the work of accommodation. This choice has consequences that ripple through Lemongrab's entire existence, shaping the being he becomes, the suffering he experiences, the harm he eventually inflicts on others. The failure to accommodate is not neutral. It is a choice with victims. What would accommodation look like for Lemongrab? The show provides hints without fully developing them. He needs predictability, routine, clear expectations that do not change without warning. He needs sensory environments that do not overwhelm, spaces where input is controlled and manageable. He needs communication that is direct and literal, without the subtext and ambiguity that confuse him. He needs patience from others, the willingness to work with his processing style rather than demanding that he adopt theirs. None of these accommodations would be impossible to provide. They would simply require effort, attention, the recognition that Lemongrab's needs matter and deserve response. The failure to provide these accommodations reflects a broader failure of imagination, an inability or unwillingness to conceive of existence from Lemongrab's perspective. The other characters assume that their way of experiencing the world is the only way, that anyone who experiences differently is simply being difficult or unreasonable. This assumption is not unique to Adventure Time. It characterizes much of how neurotypical society relates to neurodivergent individuals, the expectation that difference should be overcome through effort rather than accommodated through adaptation. Lemongrab's story illustrates the costs of this expectation, the suffering it produces, the dysfunction it creates when beings are left to struggle alone with challenges they cannot overcome through individual effort. The castle that Bubblegum gives Lemongrab might be read as a failed accommodation, an attempt to provide him with an environment suited to his needs. He has control there, can structure his space as he requires, does not have to navigate the chaos of the Candy Kingdom. But isolation is not accommodation. It is abandonment dressed up as help, distance presented as solution. Real accommodation would involve relationship, ongoing support, the continued presence of someone who cares about Lemongrab's well-being and works to promote it. The castle provides none of this. It provides walls and silence and the illusion of autonomy that is really just the absence of care. The distinction between isolation and solitude is relevant here. Solitude can be healing, a chosen withdrawal that allows for rest and recovery. Isolation is different, an imposed separation that compounds suffering rather than relieving it. Lemongrab's castle existence is isolation, not solitude. He did not choose it as a healthy withdrawal, but received it as punishment and rejection. The aloneness compounds his difficulties rather than providing space to address them. He deteriorates in his castle, becomes more rigid and extreme, demonstrates that isolation is not treatment, but neglect with geographic characteristics. The authoritarianism that Lemongrab displays in his attempts to govern reveals something important about the relationship between trauma and power. He did not learn healthy models of authority because he never experienced healthy authority himself. His creator abandoned him. His only experience of being governed was the experience of being rejected and exiled. When he assumes power, he has no template for benevolent rule, no understanding of how authority might be exercised with care and flexibility. He knows only the authority that was exercised over him, rigid, rejecting, absolute, and so he replicates this authority in his own governance, treating his subjects as he was treated, demanding compliance because compliance is what was demanded of him. The psychology of authoritarian personality has been studied extensively since the mid-20th century, and Lemongrab fits many of the patterns researchers have identified. Authoritarian individuals often emerge from environments characterized by harsh, punitive parenting, where obedience was demanded and deviation was punished. They develop rigid thinking patterns, intolerance of ambiguity, strong preferences for hierarchy and order. They project their own unacceptable impulses onto outgroups, maintaining internal coherence by locating badness outside themselves. Lemongrab displays all of these tendencies, his authoritarianism emerging predictably from the conditions of his creation and early existence. But the show complicates any simple reading of Lemongrab as authoritarian villain by continually reminding us of the suffering that produced his authoritarianism. He is not evil in any simple sense. He is damaged, shaped by experiences that would have damaged anyone, responding to trauma in ways that are destructive but comprehensible. His cruelty to his lemon subjects is wrong, genuinely harmful, not excused by his own suffering. But it is also explicable, traceable to causes that precede and exceed his individual choices. The show holds both truths simultaneously. Lemongrab is responsible for his actions, and Lemongrab's actions emerge from conditions he did not create and could not control. The lemon people who suffer under Lemongrab's rule are innocent victims of a cycle they did not start. They did not abandon Lemongrab, did not create him wrong, did not fail to accommodate his needs. They simply exist in his domain, subject to his authority, bearing the brunt of damage that originated elsewhere. This displacement of suffering is one of the most disturbing aspects of trauma's legacy. It rarely stays contained, rarely affects only the person originally harmed, tends to spread outward through relationships and generations, creating new victims who had no part in the original injury. The lemon people suffer because Bubblegum failed Lemongrab, a causal chain that distributes responsibility in ways that are difficult to pass. The dungeon that Lemongrab creates, where he imprisons those who displease him, represents the externalization of his internal experience. He lives in a kind of psychological dungeon, trapped in a consciousness that torments him, unable to escape the prison of his own neurology. The physical dungeon he builds mirrors this internal reality, creates in the external world the conditions of his internal existence. His subjects experience what he experiences: confinement, punishment, the arbitrary exercise of power by a being whose rules cannot be understood or satisfied. This mirroring is not coincidence but symptom, the attempt to make others understand his experience by subjecting them to something analogous. The question of whether Lemongrab can be reformed, whether his authoritarianism can be softened through intervention or education, is never fully answered by the show. He does not undergo the kind of redemption arc that other villainous characters experience. He is not taught better ways of being, does not learn to govern with compassion, does not transform into a benevolent ruler. He simply continues, alternating between periods of relative stability and periods of crisis, never fundamentally changing the patterns established in his earliest existence. This lack of transformation might be read as pessimistic, as the show's claim that some damage cannot be repaired. But it might also be read as realistic, as acknowledgement that change is difficult and not everyone achieves it, that some beings remain trapped in patterns they cannot escape, regardless of how much they or others might wish otherwise. The relationship between Lemongrab's authoritarianism and his neurodivergence is complex and potentially troubling. The show might seem to suggest that neurodivergent individuals are prone to authoritarian behavior, that the rigidity associated with certain neurological differences naturally leads to rigid governance. This would be a harmful message, reinforcing stereotypes that already plague neurodivergent communities. But a more careful reading suggests something different, that Lemongrab's authoritarianism emerges not from his neurodivergence per se, but from the combination of his neurodivergence and his mistreatment, that a neurodivergent being raised with care and accommodation might develop very differently. His authoritarianism is a response to trauma, not an expression of inherent nature. The episodes depicting Lemongrab's rule over the Lemon people are among the darkest in Adventure Time, depicting conditions that border on dystopian. His subjects live in fear, subject to arbitrary punishment, unable to predict what will trigger their ruler's wrath. The dungeon fills with those who have displeased him, often for offences they do not understand, violations of rules that were never clearly communicated. This is not governance, but tyranny, the exercise of power without responsibility, the imposition of order without justice. And yet the show continually reminds us of how Lemongrab came to be this way, refuses to let us forget the abandoned creation, the failed accommodation, the original wounds that produced this wounding ruler. The possibility of intervention, of someone reaching Lemongrab and helping him change, is gestured toward but never realized. Finn and Jake occasionally interact with him, sometimes with something approaching compassion, but these interactions never produce lasting change. Bubblegum occasionally takes responsibility for managing him, but management is not healing, control is not care. No one commits to the long-term work of helping Lemongrab develop different patterns, of providing the consistent support that might allow him to grow beyond his trauma. Perhaps such commitment would not work. Perhaps Lemongrab is beyond help, too damaged to change regardless of what interventions are attempted. But the commitment is never made, so the question remains unanswered, the possibility forever unrealized. The show's refusal to reform Lemongrab distinguishes it from many narratives featuring difficult or villainous characters. The redemption arc has become almost obligatory in contemporary storytelling. The expectation that characters who do wrong will eventually see the light and change their ways. This expectation can be valuable, modelling the possibility of growth and the reality of human capacity for change. But it can also be dishonest, suggesting that change is easier than it actually is, that good intentions and dramatic realizations are sufficient to overcome deeply ingrained patterns. Lemongrab's unreformed existence is a corrective to this dishonesty, a reminder that some damage persists, that some beings do not change, that the happy ending is not guaranteed. The contrast between Lemongrab and other Adventure Time characters who do experience redemption is instructive. Ice King is eventually restored to Simon, given a second chance at the life he lost. Marceline works through her father issues and finds peace with Bubblegum. Even some villains are given opportunities for growth and change. Lemongrab receives no such opportunity, or rather, receives no opportunity that he is capable of taking. The resources for his redemption are never provided, the support never offered, the patience never extended. His lack of change reflects not just his limitations, but the limitations of those around him, their failure to provide what redemption would require. The sound that Lemongrab makes, that distinctive elongated scream that has become his signature, functions in the show as both comedy and communication. It is funny because it is excessive, because it violates the norms of reasonable response, because its intensity seems disproportionate to its triggers. But it is also communication, the only language Lemongrab has for experiences that exceed his capacity to articulate. He screams because he cannot say what he means, because the words he has access to cannot capture the reality of his experience, because sometimes sound without meaning is the only honest response to overwhelming sensation. The scream connects Lemongrab to a long tradition of artistic expression that uses wordless sound to convey what words cannot. The primal scream in therapy, the wordless vocalizations of experimental music, the cries of grief that exceed language, all recognize that some experiences are too big for the containers we usually put them in. Lemongrab's scream belongs to this tradition, represents the breaking point where articulate speech fails and raw sound takes over. That the show plays this for comedy does not negate its expressive function. Comedy and tragedy often occupy the same territory, distinguished only by framing and audience expectation. For neurodivergent viewers, Lemongrab's scream may resonate as representation of experiences they have had but rarely seen depicted. The meltdown, the moment when regulation fails and everything comes pouring out, is a real phenomenon familiar to many people with sensory processing differences or emotional regulation difficulties. It is also a phenomenon that is usually hidden, suppressed, managed privately because public display invites judgment and rejection. Lemongrab screams publicly, loudly, without apparent shame, and while the show invites us to laugh, it also invites us to see, to witness an experience that is usually kept invisible. This visibility, however complicated by comedic framing, has value for viewers who have felt alone in their own overwhelming experiences. The function of the scream within the narrative is usually to escalate conflict, to signal that Lemongrab has reached his limit, to precipitate the crisis that the episode will then resolve. This narrative function mirrors the real-world function of meltdowns. They signal system overload, indicate that current conditions cannot continue, force some kind of change, even if that change is simply the end of the triggering situation. Lemongrab's screams do not solve his problems, but they do mark turning points, moments when the pressure exceeds what can be contained and something has to give. The something that gives is usually Lemongrab's composure, but the giving creates space for narrative movement, for other characters to respond, for situations to shift. The aftermath of Lemongrab's screams is rarely depicted with much care. He screams, the episode moves on, his distress becomes background to whatever plot is advancing. This lack of aftermath mirrors how meltdowns are often treated in real life, as disruptions to be moved past, rather than experiences to be processed and understood. A more compassionate narrative might explore what happens after the scream, might show Lemongrab recovering, might depict the exhaustion and shame that often follow loss of control. The show's failure to provide this aftermath is itself a kind of statement, an indication that Lemongrab's inner experience is not the show's primary concern, that his distress matters mainly for its effects on others and on plot. The evolution of Lemongrab's scream across the series tracks his deterioration and occasional stabilization. In early appearances, the scream is already present, but perhaps less central to his character. As his story develops, as his isolation deepens, and his methods become more extreme, the scream becomes more prominent, more central to how he is depicted, more thoroughly identified with his being. By the time he has consumed Lemongrab 2 and become the grotesque tyrant of Castle Lemongrab, the scream has become almost his primary mode of expression, the thing he does more than anything else. This escalation represents the narrowing of his existence, the reduction of his being to its most distressed elements, the loss of whatever else he might have been if things had gone differently. The voice acting that brings Lemongrab's scream to life deserves recognition for its contribution to the character's impact. Justin Roiland's performance finds the exact register of absurdity and agony that makes Lemongrab memorable. creates a sound that is simultaneously hilarious and uncomfortable, that lodges in the memory and refuses to leave. This performance is not simply loud or exaggerated. It is precisely calibrated to produce a specific effect, to make viewers laugh while also making them uneasy, to entertain while also disturbing. The scream would not work without this precision, would be simply annoying rather than meaningful, would fail to communicate what Lemongrab's existence actually feels like. The cultural afterlife of Lemongrab's scream, its existence as meme and reference and imitation, raises questions about how suffering becomes entertainment. People imitate his scream at conventions, share clips of his most extreme moments, find joy in his distress. This is not necessarily wrong. Comedy has always found material in suffering, has always transformed pain into pleasure through the alchemy of performance and framing. But there is something worth noting about the eagerness with which Lemongrab's anguish has been embraced as entertainment, the way his suffering has become detached from its context and consumed as pure spectacle. The meme version of Lemongrab loses the tragedy, keeps only the comedy, reduces a complex character to a funny noise. For viewers who return to Lemongrab after encountering him first as meme, the experience can be jarring. The actual character is so much more than the scream, contains depths of pathos that the meme obscures, tells a story that is genuinely tragic beneath its comic surface. This disjunction between meme and character might prompt reflection on how we consume media, how we extract moments from context, how we transform complex narratives into simple pleasures. Lemongrab deserves better than to be reduced to a sound effect, even if that sound effect is undeniably compelling. His story is worth engaging with fully, in all its discomfort, rather than simply laughing at its most extreme moments. The scream also functions as a kind of honesty that other characters lack. Most beings in Adventure Time, like most people in real life, manage their expressions, present controlled versions of their internal states, hide distress behind acceptable facades. Lemongrab cannot or will not do this. His internal state is always externalized, always visible, always audible. This transparency is socially costly, but also represents a kind of integrity, the refusal or inability to pretend that things are other than they are. When Lemongrab screams, you know exactly how he feels. There is no mystery, no hidden layer, no gap between appearance and reality. This might be dysfunction, but it is also authenticity of a sort that more regulated beings rarely achieve. The relationship between Lemongrab's scream and music is worth noting, given Adventure Time's significant musical elements. Where other characters express themselves through song, through composed and structured musical performance, Lemongrab expresses himself through raw vocalization, through sound that refuses the constraints of melody and rhythm. His scream is anti-music, the breakdown of musical structure into pure expression. This contrast positions him outside even the show's most reliable mode of emotional communication, unable to participate in the musical language that connects other characters to each other and to the audience. The scream's persistence across the series, its refusal to evolve into something more moderate or controlled, suggests that Lemongrab does not develop the regulation that time and experience provide to most beings. He does not learn to modulate his responses, does not develop coping strategies that would allow for more measured expression. This lack of development might be neurological, the result of processing differences that cannot be overcome through practice. Or it might be the result of his isolation, the absence of relationships that might have helped him learn regulation, the lack of patient others who might have modelled more controlled response. The question of whether Lemongrab has a soul whether he possesses the moral status that would make his suffering matter in some ultimate sense, runs beneath the surface of his entire narrative. He is a created being, brought into existence through science, rather than born through natural processes. Does this origin affect his moral status? Does it make his consciousness less real, his suffering less important, his existence less valuable than the existence of naturally born beings? The show never directly addresses these questions, but they haunt every scene involving Lemongrab, every decision made about how to treat him, every failure to extend to him the compassion that other characters receive. In the Adventure Time universe, created beings are generally treated as persons, as moral patients deserving of consideration and respect. The Candy People are created by Bubblegum, but are not treated as less than persons because of their origin. Bimo is a robot, but is valued and loved as a member of the Treehouse family. The principle seems to be that consciousness matters regardless of its origin, that beings capable of experience deserve moral consideration whether they were born or made. But Lemongrab tests this principle by being so difficult, so unpleasant, so resistant to the easy affection that other created beings receive. His case asks whether moral consideration extends to beings we do not like, beings who do not make us feel good, beings whose existence creates problems rather than solving them. The philosophical tradition offers various frameworks for thinking about moral status and its grounds. Sentience-based views hold that the capacity to feel, to have experiences that matter to the being having them, is what grounds moral consideration. On this view, Lemongrab clearly has moral status because he clearly feels, clearly suffers, clearly has experiences that matter to him. His suffering is real suffering, not simulation or pretense, and this reality generates moral claims regardless of how difficult he is or how he came to exist. The fact that Bubblegum created him does not reduce these claims, but if anything strengthens them, because she brought into existence a being capable of suffering, and thereby took on responsibility for that suffering. Other frameworks emphasize rationality or moral agency as grounds for moral status, and Lemongrab's position relative to these criteria is more ambiguous. He is rational in some senses, capable of forming plans and pursuing goals, but his rationality is compromised by his sensory and emotional difficulties, by the overwhelm that prevents clear thinking, by the rigidity that limits his ability to adapt to new information. He has moral agency in some senses, is capable of making choices and acting on them, but his agency is constrained by patterns he did not choose and cannot easily change, by the damage that shapes his responses before conscious decision can intervene. If moral status requires full rationality or uncompromised agency, Lemongrab might fall short. But these requirements seem too demanding, would exclude many beings we intuitively believe deserve moral consideration. The treatment Lemongrab receives from other characters suggests that his moral status is, at best, ambiguous in their eyes. He is not treated with the care that would indicate full moral consideration. He is manipulated, deceived, exiled, treated as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. Some of this treatment might be justified by his own behavior, by the harm he causes to others, by the legitimate need to protect his victims from his cruelty. But some of it precedes his harmful behavior, reflects prejudgments about his worth based on his difficulty rather than his actions. The other characters seem to view him as less deserving of consideration than other beings, whether because of his created status, his unpleasantness, or simply their inability to empathize with someone so different from themselves. The audience's position relative to Lemongrab's moral status is similarly complicated. The show invites us to laugh at him, to find his distress amusing, to enjoy the spectacle of his suffering, without taking it seriously as suffering. This invitation positions us as viewers who do not fully grant him moral status, who treat his experiences as entertainment rather than tragedy. But the show also provides resources for a different viewing, moments of genuine pathos, where Lemongrab's pain is undeniable, where laughter becomes uncomfortable, where we are forced to recognize the being beneath the comedy. These moments invite us to reconsider our earlier laughter, to grant Lemongrab the moral status we initially withheld, to take seriously what we had been treating as joke. The discomfort that arises when comedy meets genuine suffering is part of what makes Lemongrab such a compelling character. The show does not resolve this discomfort, does not tell us definitively whether to laugh or cry, whether to dismiss his pain as absurdity or honor it as real. It holds both possibilities open, allows viewers to navigate between them, creates space for the complex response that genuine art often demands. Lemongrab is funny and tragic simultaneously, and the simultaneity is the point, the refusal to separate comedy from tragedy that most entertainment carefully maintains. The question of what we owe difficult beings, beings whose existence creates problems, beings who are not easy to love or even to like, is one of the most challenging ethical questions we face. It is easy to extend moral consideration to beings who are pleasant, who reciprocate our care, who make us feel good about ourselves for caring. It is much harder to extend the same consideration to beings like Lemongrab, who are unpleasant, who do not reciprocate, who make care feel like burden rather than gift. But moral consideration that depends on the considered being's pleasantness is not really moral consideration at all. It is merely preference dressed up as ethics, the elevation of our comfort into moral principle. Lemongrab challenges us to consider whether our moral frameworks are robust enough to include beings we do not like. If moral status depends on sentience, on the capacity to suffer, then Lemongrab clearly qualifies regardless of how unpleasant he is. If moral status depends on relationship, on connection, on the bonds that tie beings together, then Lemongrab's isolation and difficulty make his status more ambiguous but also more urgent, because he is precisely the kind of being who falls through the cracks of relationship-based ethics. If moral status depends on potential, on what a being might become with proper support, then Lemongrab's unrealized potential, the person he might have been without mistreatment, demands consideration, even if his actual state falls short. The show does not resolve these ethical questions, but poses them with unusual clarity. Lemongrab is a test case for our moral intuitions, a being designed to probe the limits of our compassion and find where those limits lie. Viewers who can extend compassion to him, who can see his suffering as real and important, despite his difficulty, have expanded their moral circle in ways that might matter beyond the fictional context. Viewers who cannot extend this compassion, who remain positioned as laughing observers of his pain, might learn something about the limits of their own ethics, the conditions under which they withhold the consideration they claim to value. The final question Lemongrab poses is whether beings made wrong deserve the same consideration as beings made right, whether defective creation implies diminished moral status, whether the failures of our origins can be held against us in moral accounting. The answer that compassion suggests is no, that our origins do not determine our worth, that beings cannot be blamed for how they were made, even if they can be held responsible for what they do with their making. Lemongrab did not choose his wrongness. He was made wrong by a creator who then abandoned him. Whatever he has become, whatever harm he has caused, these facts remain. He did not make himself. He did not choose his suffering. He deserves consideration, not because of what he is, but simply because he is. A conscious being in a universe where consciousness itself generates moral claims. The lemon people that Lemongrab creates represent both his attempt at connection and his replication of the very patterns that damaged him. He brings beings into existence because he is lonely, because he wants subjects and companions, because creation is perhaps the only form of relationship available to someone as isolated as he is. But his creations inherit his dysfunction, emerge into a world ruled by his trauma, become victims of the patterns he learned from his own failed creation. The cycle continues, the damage spreads. What was done to Lemongrab is done by Lemongrab to beings who had no part in his original wounding. The lemon children are strange beings, misshapen and odd, clearly products of a creator who does not fully understand how creation should work. They are wrong in their own ways, carry their own versions of the wrongness that defines their creator. This might be read as genetic inheritance, the passing down of defect from parent to child. Or it might be read as environmental transmission, the shaping of new beings by the damaged context into which they are born. Either way, the result is the same. More beings who struggle, more consciousness that suffers, more wrongness propagating through the generations. The show's depiction of the lemon people raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of reproduction and creation when the creator is damaged. Should Lemongrab have created these beings, knowing what he is, knowing the world he would bring them into? The question parallels debates about human reproduction, about whether individuals with heritable conditions or difficult circumstances should have children, about the ethics of bringing new consciousness into contexts of suffering. These debates have no easy answers, and the show does not pretend otherwise. It simply depicts the lemon people existing, struggling, suffering under their creator's rule, and leaves viewers to draw their own conclusions about whether their creation was justified. The lemon people's eventual rebellion against Lemongrab represents a kind of hope, the possibility that created beings can transcend the limitations of their creators, can build something better than what they were given. They organize, resist, eventually participate in the intervention that splits Lemongrab back into two beings. This agency suggests that wrongness is not destiny, that beings made badly can still act well, that the damage inherited from creators does not absolutely determine what the created will become. The cycle can be broken. Even if breaking, it requires struggle and pain and the willingness to challenge those who made you. But the rebellion also raises questions about the obligations children have to parents, even parents who have harmed them. Do the lemon people owe Lemongrab anything? He created them, gave them existence, is in some sense responsible for every moment of consciousness they experience. But he also mistreated them, failed to care for them properly, replicated with them the very patterns that damaged him. The show suggests that existence alone does not generate unlimited obligation, that creators who harm their creations forfeit some of the consideration that creation might otherwise entail. The lemon people are right to rebel, right to protect themselves, right to prioritize their own well-being over loyalty to a creator who has not earned their loyalty. The community that the lemon people form represents an alternative to the isolation that has characterized Lemongrab's existence. Where he has been alone, they have each other. Where he has had no one who understands his experience, they share a common origin that creates mutual understanding. Where he has been abandoned by his creator, they maintain connection with each other even as they resist his authority. This community is not perfect, is not free of conflict or difficulty, but it is something, a social structure that might provide what Lemongrab never had: belonging, understanding, the company of others who share your way of being in the world. The possibility that community might be the answer to the suffering that isolation produces is one of the more hopeful threads in Lemongrab's story. He was made wrong, but he was also made alone, isolated from others who might have helped him cope with his wrongness. The Lemon people demonstrate that wrongness shared is more bearable than wrongness endured in solitude, that beings who struggle can support each other in their struggling, that the pain of existence is lessened when it is not faced alone. Lemongrab never had this support. His creations, despite everything, might be building it for themselves. The contrast between Lemongrab's isolation and the Lemon people's community highlights what might have been different if Lemongrab had received proper support. Imagine a version of his story where Bubblegum had created others like him, had built a community of beings who shared his neurology, had provided the social context that his individual creation lacked. This counterfactual is never explored by the show, but it haunts the narrative, suggests possibilities that were foreclosed by the choices Bubblegum made. Lemongrab did not have to be alone. He was made alone because his creator chose not to provide companionship, chose isolation over community, chose the easy solution of distance over the harder solution of connection. The Lemon people's existence also raises questions about legacy and inheritance, about what we pass on to those who come after us. Lemongrab's creations inherit his wrongness, but also his capacity for connection, his desire for relationship, his fundamental need for others, even when that need is expressed in damaging ways. They are not simply copies of his dysfunction, but variations on his themes, beings who take what he gave them and transform it into something partly new. This transformation is itself a form of hope, evidence that inheritance is not destiny, that what we receive from our creators can be reworked even if it cannot be entirely escaped. The show's treatment of the Lemon people evolves across their appearances, giving them increasing individuality and agency as the narrative develops. Early depictions present them primarily as Lemongrab's subjects defined by their relationship to him. Later depictions show them as beings in their own right, with their own desires and conflicts and possibilities. This evolution mirrors the process by which children differentiate from parents, by which created beings establish identities separate from their creators. The Lemon people become more than what Lemongrab made them to be, and this becoming is itself an argument against the determinism that their origin might seem to imply. The specific Lemon characters who emerge as individuals deserve attention for what they reveal about possibility within constraint. Each has taken the raw material of Lemon creation and made something particular from it, has developed characteristics that are recognizably Lemon, but also distinctly their own. This individuation within shared origin provides hope for anyone who feels determined by their background, anyone who fears that where they came from inevitably defines where they can go. The Lemon people are not simply copies of their creator. They are variations, elaborations, transformations of what they were given into what they have chosen to become. The question of whether the Lemon people are better off for having been created, despite the suffering their existence entails, connects to philosophical debates about the value of existence itself. Would it have been better for them never to have existed, never to have experienced the tyranny and trauma that Lemongrab's rule imposed? Or is existence itself valuable enough to outweigh even significant suffering? The show does not answer this question definitively, but the lemon people's own choices suggest an answer. They fight to survive, work to build community, resist their creator's cruelty, rather than accepting annihilation. These choices imply that they value their existence, that being alive matters to them even when being alive is hard. The body horror elements that characterize Lemongrab's later appearances serve specific narrative and thematic functions beyond simple shock value. When he consumes Lemongrab 2, his body swells grotesquely, becoming a visual representation of his psychological state. He is bloated with unprocessed pain, distorted by the weight of what he has consumed, transformed into something monstrous, not just behaviorally, but physically. The outside matches the inside. The body tells the truth that social presentation usually conceals. This transformation echoes traditions of body horror in literature and film that use physical grotesquerie to externalize psychological or moral conditions. The monster's body represents the monster's soul, makes visible what would otherwise be hidden, forces viewers to confront what might otherwise be ignored. Lemongrab's swollen form cannot be overlooked or dismissed. It demands response, provokes reaction, makes impossible the polite ignorance that might otherwise allow his suffering and his cruelty to go unaddressed. The body becomes evidence, testimony written in flesh, the undeniable record of what has been done and what has been become. The show's willingness to make Lemongrab physically repulsive is a significant choice. Children's animation typically avoids genuine grotesquerie, maintains a certain pleasantness of appearance even when depicting villains or monsters. Lemongrab's bloated form violates this convention, creates visual discomfort that mirrors the emotional discomfort his character produces. This violation is not gratuitous. It serves the story, deepens the character, makes physical what would otherwise remain merely conceptual. We see what consuming another being does to you. We see what unprocessed trauma looks like when it accumulates without release. We see the body as record of the soul's condition. The eventual splitting of Lemongrab back into two beings represents a kind of violent correction, a forced undoing of the consumption that should never have occurred. The Lemon children perform this splitting, separating what should never have been joined, restoring the separation that Lemongrab's desperate need for control had eliminated. This is not healing in any therapeutic sense. It is surgery without anesthesia, intervention without consent, the imposition of change from outside rather than the emergence of change from within. But it is also necessary, the only way to undo what Lemongrab had done, the violent solution to a violent problem. The two Lemongrabs who emerged from this splitting are not the same beings who existed before. They carry the memory of merger, the experience of having been one grotesque being, the trauma of separation added to all their previous traumas. They are not healed, not fixed, not restored to some original innocent state. They are simply separated, allowed to exist again as two distinct beings rather than one monstrous amalgamation. This limited restoration is the best the show offers, the most hopeful outcome available given what has occurred. It is not happy ending, but simply ending, the cessation of one particular horror without the resolution of the underlying conditions that produced it. The body horror also connects to broader themes of consumption and control that run through Lemongrab's character. He consumes Lemongrab 2 because he cannot tolerate the other's separate existence, because his need for control extends to the elimination of anything that might challenge that control. This is consumption as domination, eating, as the ultimate expression of power over another being. The grotesque body that results is the body of domination, the physical form of absolute control taken to its logical conclusion. To consume another is to become monstrous, and the monster's body is the proof. The visual design choices that create Lemongrab's post-consumption form deserve attention for their effectiveness. The bloated, asymmetrical mass he becomes is disturbing in ways that go beyond simple ugliness. There is something wrong about it, at a fundamental level, something that triggers disgust responses rooted deep in human psychology. This wrongness is intentional, designed to produce the reaction it produces, to make viewers feel in their bodies what they understand in their minds about what Lemongrab has done and become. The animation team understood that some truths require visceral communication, that intellectual understanding alone is insufficient for the full impact of Lemongrab's transformation. The relationship between inner and outer in Lemongrab's bodily transformation reflects philosophical traditions that connect physical appearance to moral condition. The idea that the body reflects the soul, that outer form expresses inner reality, runs through religious and philosophical thought across cultures. Lemongrab's grotesque body, after consuming Lemongrab 2, embodies this connection, makes literal what is usually metaphorical, shows us what it looks like when a being's physical form actually does match their psychological state. This literalization is one of animation's unique capacities, the ability to make visible what in live action must remain symbolic or implied. The process of splitting Lemongrab back into two beings is itself horrifying, a violent undoing that does not restore innocence, but simply creates two damaged beings where there had been one monstrous amalgamation. The Lemon children who perform this splitting act with something like surgical necessity, doing what must be done regardless of the pain it causes. There is no anesthesia for this procedure, no gentle transition, no healing framework within which the violence makes sense. There is only the cutting, the separation, the creation of two screaming beings from one screaming mass. The cure is as traumatic as the disease. The aftermath of the splitting leaves us with two Lemongrabs, who must somehow continue to exist, who carry the memory of what they were when they were one, who have been through something that no being should have to experience. The show does not dwell on their recovery, does not explore how they process this trauma, does not provide the therapeutic framework that their experience would seem to require. They are simply there, split, continuing, damaged in new ways, on top of all the old ways they were damaged before. This lack of processing mirrors how trauma often functions in real life, overwhelming events that must be survived but cannot be fully integrated. Experiences that shape everything that follows without ever being adequately addressed. The symbolism of consumption and separation in Lemongrab's arc speaks to psychological dynamics that extend beyond his particular story. The desire to consume the other, to eliminate separateness, to make the beloved or feared other part of oneself, is a recognizable psychological pattern. It appears in relationships characterized by enmeshment, in attachments that cannot tolerate the other's autonomy, in love that becomes possession. Lemongrab's literal consumption of Lemongrab 2 makes physical what in human relationships remains psychological, externalizes an internal dynamic so that it can be seen and understood. The reversal of this consumption through splitting similarly speaks to the process of individuation, of establishing boundaries, of becoming separate from those with whom we have been merged. This process is painful in real life, even when it does not involve physical division. The establishment of separateness, the recognition that the other is not part of oneself, the acceptance of distance and difference. These are psychological achievements that many people struggle to attain. The lemon children, who perform the splitting, are enacting symbolically what therapy and growth enact psychologically, the creation of appropriate boundaries where enmeshment had eliminated them. The visual horror of the splitting scene serves important narrative purposes beyond shock value. It makes visceral what might otherwise remain abstract, forces viewers to experience the violence of separation rather than merely understanding it conceptually. This visceral experience creates emotional memory, ensures that the splitting will not be forgotten or minimized, marks it as a significant event in Lemongrab's arc. The show understands that some truths require bodily communication, that intellectual understanding alone cannot capture the full weight of what characters experience. The question of whether Lemongrab deserves sympathy is one that the show raises without definitively answering. He is a victim, clearly, damaged by circumstances he did not create and could not control. But he is also a perpetrator, someone who has caused genuine harm to innocent beings, who has inflicted suffering that his own suffering does not justify. The show holds both of these truths simultaneously, refuses to resolve the tension between them, leaves viewers to navigate their own response to a character who is both pitiable and condemnable. The case for sympathy rests on the chain of causation that produced Lemongrab's harmful behaviour. He did not choose to be made wrong. He did not choose to be abandoned. He did not choose the isolation and rejection that shaped his development. By the time he is making choices at all, the patterns are already established, the damage already done, the trajectory already set. His cruelty emerges from this prior damage as predictable consequence, the almost inevitable result of what was done to him before he had any capacity to resist or redirect. To blame him for this cruelty without acknowledging its causes seems incomplete, seems to miss the larger picture of how beings come to be what they are. The case against sympathy rests on the reality of his victims, on the lemon people who suffer under his rule, on Lemongrab too, who was consumed, on everyone harmed by his behaviour regardless of its causes. These victims did not create Lemongrab's damage. They are not responsible for his suffering. They simply exist in his proximity and bear the consequences of his dysfunction. To focus too much on Lemongrab's suffering risks, minimizing theirs, risks treating their pain as less important because it was caused by someone who was also in pain. Sympathy for perpetrators should not come at the cost of justice for victims. The show's refusal to resolve this tension reflects the genuine difficulty of the moral question it raises. In real life, perpetrators of harm are often themselves victims of prior harm, damaged beings whose damage has spread to others. How should we respond to such beings? Punishment seems inadequate because it does not address the underlying causes. Forgiveness seems premature if it comes without accountability. Understanding the causes does not erase the effects. The harm is real, regardless of why it occurred. These are not questions with easy answers, and any narrative that pretends otherwise is simplifying a complexity that deserves respect. What the show models is something like tragic recognition, the acknowledgement that Lemongrab is both victim and perpetrator, both deserving of compassion and accountable for his actions. This dual recognition is uncomfortable, but more honest than either pure condemnation or pure sympathy would be. Lemongrab is a being about whom we should feel conflicted, whose story should leave us uncertain about how to respond, who resists the easy categorization that would make moral judgment simple. The discomfort he produces is appropriate to the reality he represents. The The question of sympathy also connects to broader questions about how we respond to difficult people in real life. Many people who cause harm are themselves harmed, carry damage that explains, if not excuses their behavior, deserve understanding, even as they require accountability. The skill of holding sympathy and accountability together, of recognizing victimization without losing sight of responsibility, is one that real moral navigation requires. Lemongrab's story provides practice in this skill, an opportunity to develop the capacity for complex moral response that simpler narratives do not demand. The concept of moral luck is relevant to understanding Lemongrab's situation. Moral luck refers to the way that factors beyond our control affect our moral standing, the way that circumstance shapes who we become and what we do in ways we did not choose. Lemongrab is unlucky in nearly every way relevant to moral development. He was made wrong, abandoned, isolated, denied the resources that might have allowed him to become someone better. His cruelty emerges from this unlucky beginning as something close to inevitable, the predictable result of conditions he did not create. To what extent can we hold him responsible for outcomes that were largely determined by factors beyond his control? The philosophical debate about free will and determinism underlies these questions about Lemongrab's responsibility. If his actions are the inevitable result of prior causes, if he could not have done otherwise given who he is and how he came to be that way, then responsibility in the traditional sense seems problematic. But if we abandon responsibility entirely, if we excuse all harmful behavior because it has causes, then accountability becomes impossible and victims' claims for justice lose their force. Lemongrab exists in this tension, a being whose harmful actions seem both caused and condemnable, both determined and deserving of response. The show does not resolve this philosophical tension because it cannot be resolved, at least not through fictional narrative. It simply presents Lemongrab in his complexity, allows viewers to feel both sympathy and condemnation, models the kind of ambivalent response that morally complex situations actually require. This ambivalence is not failure of moral clarity, but achievement of moral sophistication. The recognition that some situations do not admit of simple judgment, that some beings defy easy categorization, that the demand for moral simplicity is itself a kind of immaturity that the show refuses to indulge. The practical implications of this ambivalence matter for how we relate to difficult people in our own lives. If we can hold both sympathy and accountability for Lemongrab, we might develop capacity to hold both for real people who have harmed us or others while carrying their own damage. This capacity is not automatic forgiveness, not the erasure of harm, not the abandonment of justified anger. It is simply the ability to see whole beings rather than cardboard villains, to recognize that those who harm are often harmed, to respond to complexity with complexity rather than with the simplifying rage that protects us from uncomfortable ambivalence. The role of explanation in moral judgment is crucial to understanding how we might respond to Lemongrab. Explanation is not excuse. Understanding why someone became harmful does not make their harm acceptable, does not eliminate the need for accountability, does not require that we forgive or forget. But explanation does change the texture of our response, shifts it from simple condemnation to something more nuanced, allows us to recognize the being behind the behavior without losing sight of the behavior's impact. Lemongrab's backstory explains his cruelty without excusing it, and this explanation without excuse is the mature moral stance the show invites us to adopt. The victims of Lemongrab's cruelty deserve attention that the show does not always adequately provide. The lemon people who suffer under his rule, Lemongrab 2, who was consumed, these beings have their own claims to consideration that should not be subordinated to sympathy for their persecutor. A focus on Lemongrab's suffering that ignores the suffering he causes would be morally incomplete, would center the perpetrator at the expense of those he harms. The show's ambivalence must include attention to victims as well as understanding of the victimizer, must hold space for multiple perspectives without collapsing them into a single narrative that serves only one party's interests. The danger of excessive sympathy for perpetrators is real and worth acknowledging. Understanding why someone became harmful can slide into excusing their harm, can shift focus from victims to victimizers in ways that compound original injustices. Lemongrab's story walks this line carefully, providing understanding without excuse, sympathy without absolution. But viewers must exercise their own judgment, must resist the pull towards simple narratives that would either demonize Lemongrab completely or absolve him entirely. The moral work the show invites is difficult precisely because it refuses these simplifications. The absence of resolution in Lemongrab's arc represents a deliberate narrative choice that distinguishes his story from most character arcs in Adventure Time and in children's entertainment more broadly. He does not learn, does not grow, does not achieve the transformation that would allow his story to end happily. He simply continues, unchanged or inadequately changed, carrying his wrongness forward through time. This lack of resolution might frustrate viewers who expect character arcs to arc, who anticipate growth and change and eventual peace. But it also represents a kind of honesty that more conventional narratives lack. The expectation that characters should change, should grow, should overcome their difficulties, reflects assumptions about human development that are partially but not entirely accurate. Some people do change significantly over time, do overcome early damage, do achieve lives very different from what their origins might have predicted, but some people do not. Some damage is permanent, or nearly so. Some patterns persist, regardless of effort or intervention. Some beings remain trapped in the configurations established in their earliest experience, unable to break free despite whatever desire they might have to do so. Lemongrab represents this latter possibility, the being for whom change does not come, for whom the arc does not complete. This representation has value for viewers who have experienced similar stuckness, who have struggled to change patterns they know are harmful, who have watched themselves repeat behaviors they desperately wish they could stop. The relentless narrative of growth and transformation can be oppressive for those who do not experience it, can make their stuckness feel like personal failure, can suggest that everyone should be able to change if only they try hard enough. Lemongrab's unchanged existence offers a different message, that some beings do not change, that this is reality and not just failure, that existence without transformation is still existence and still deserves acknowledgement. The show's other characters do generally experience change, do grow and develop, do move through arcs that conventional narrative structure rewards. Finn grows from child to young adult. Bubblegum learns to soften her controlling tendencies. Marceline works through her trauma and finds healthy relationship. These arcs provide the satisfaction that audiences expect, model the possibility of growth that viewers might find inspiring. Lemongrab's lack of equivalent arc stands out against this background, makes his stuckness more visible by contrast, raises questions about why some beings change and others do not. The factors that might explain this difference are multiple. Lemongrab's damage is earlier and more fundamental than what most other characters experienced. His isolation prevented the relationships that facilitate growth. His neurology may limit his capacity for the kind of change that more neurotypical characters can achieve. The show does not definitively explain why Lemongrab does not change, but it provides enough context to make his stuckness comprehensible rather than simply arbitrary. He is stuck for reasons, even if those reasons do not make his stuckness any less real or any less painful. The viewer's response to Lemongrab's lack of resolution might itself be informative. If you find his unchanged existence frustrating, worth asking why. What does it mean to expect that characters should change? What assumptions about possibility and responsibility underlie that expectation? If you find his unchanged existence sad, worth sitting with that sadness, letting it inform how you think about real beings who similarly do not change. If you find his unchanged existence realistic, worth considering what that says about your experience of the world, about the beings you have known who remain stuck despite everything. Lemongrab provokes response, and the response you have reveals something about who you are and what you believe about beings and their capacity for transformation. The show's willingness to leave Lemongrab unresolved is a form of respect, both for the character and for the audience. It respects the character by not forcing him into a transformation that his psychology and history do not support, by allowing him to be what he is rather than what narrative convention might demand. It respects the audience by not providing the easy satisfaction of resolution, by trusting viewers to handle complexity and incompleteness, by refusing to tie up loose ends that in real life remain perpetually untied. The question of what happens to Lemongrab after the show ends, in the future that the narrative does not depict, is left open. Will he continue as he has been, cycling through crises and relative stability, never fundamentally changing? Will something eventually reach him, some intervention or relationship or experience that finally produces the transformation the show did not provide? Will he deteriorate further, become more monstrous, inflict more harm? These possibilities all remain live, undetermined by the narrative, left for viewers to imagine as they will. This openness is itself a kind of realism, the acknowledgement that stories end but lives continue, that the frame of the narrative captures only a portion of an existence that extends beyond its boundaries. The contrast between Lemongrab's stasis and the show's general commitment to change and growth makes his unchanging nature more visible and more significant. Adventure Time believes in change. It shows characters transforming, growing, becoming better versions of themselves through effort and relationship and time. This belief in change is one of the show's most consistent themes, communicated through arc after arc of development and transformation. Lemongrab's failure to participate in this change is thus not simply absence, but statement. The assertion that change is not universal, that some beings do not or cannot transform, regardless of the show's general optimism about transformation's possibility. This exception to the show's general rule raises questions about what makes change possible, about the conditions that must be met for transformation to occur. Other characters who change have relationships that support their change, have resources that enable their growth, have enough stability to undertake the risky work of becoming different. Lemongrab has none of these. He is isolated, under-resourced, constantly in crisis. His failure to change might reflect not his inherent incapacity, but the absence of conditions that change requires. In different circumstances, with different support, Lemongrab might have become someone different. But those circumstances were never provided, and so he remains what he is, a being whose potential for change was never given the conditions it would have needed to be realized. The implications of Lemongrab's stuckness for how we think about change in our own lives are significant. If change requires conditions, then failure to change might not be personal failure, but rather the absence of necessary conditions. This reframing shifts responsibility from the individual who fails to change to the environment that fails to provide what change requires. It does not eliminate individual responsibility entirely, but it complicates it, adds awareness of structural factors that shape what individuals can and cannot achieve. Lemongrab is stuck, but his stuckness is not simply his fault. It is the product of a system that failed to support him, a creator who abandoned him, a world that provided isolation instead of connection. The show's treatment of Lemongrab ultimately leaves us with more questions than answers, more complexity than resolution, more discomfort than satisfaction. This is not failure, but achievement, the creation of a character who resists easy understanding, who demands that we sit with difficulty rather than resolving it prematurely. Lemongrab is made wrong, and the wrongness persists, and we must somehow respond to this persistence without the tools that simpler narratives would provide. The response we develop, whatever it turns out to be, will be more honest and more useful than any response that simpler narratives might have enabled. The comparison between Lemongrab and other Adventure Time characters who were also created rather than born illuminates what makes his situation uniquely tragic. The Candy People were created by Bubblegum, as was Lemongrab, yet they generally function well, experience happiness, participate in community, without the overwhelming dysfunction that characterizes his existence. BMO was created as a gaming console, yet has become one of the most genuinely content beings in the show's universe. The question of why Lemongrab suffers where others thrive points toward the specific factors that make his creation a failure rather than a success. The most obvious difference is that Lemongrab was made wrong in some fundamental way that other creations were not. His neurology, his sensory processing, his emotional regulation, something in the basic structure of his being is different from what Bubblegum intended or what would allow him to function well. This wrongness is not his fault, was not his choice, emerged from the creation process in ways that neither he nor his creator could control. But the wrongness is real, creates genuine difficulty, makes existence harder for him than it is for beings made right. The Candy People do not struggle as he struggles because they were not made with his particular configuration of difficulty. But the wrongness alone does not explain everything. Many beings are made with difficulties, yet manage to build meaningful lives. What distinguishes Lemongrab is the combination of his inherent wrongness with the abandonment and isolation that followed his creation. He was made wrong and then left alone with his wrongness, denied the support that might have helped him cope, rejected by the Creator who might have provided guidance. Other created beings in Adventure Time receive ongoing relationship with their Creator, remain part of the community that Bubblegum leads, have access to resources and support that Lemongrab was denied. His suffering is the product of two factors working together: the wrongness he was born with and the abandonment that followed. This dual causation complicates any simple moral assessment of Lemongrab's situation. If his wrongness alone caused his suffering, then Bubblegum might be blameless, might have simply made an unfortunate mistake in creation that could not have been prevented or corrected. If his abandonment alone caused his suffering, then the wrongness would be irrelevant, and any being treated as he was treated would have ended up similarly damaged. But the reality is that both factors matter, that his suffering emerges from their interaction, that things might have been different if either factor had been absent. Bubblegum is not entirely responsible for Lemongrab's condition, but she is not entirely innocent either. The comparison with Bimo is particularly instructive because Bimo was also created alone, was not part of a community of similar beings, might have experienced isolation comparable to what Lemongrab experienced. Yet Bimo thrives where Lemongrab suffers. The difference seems to lie in Bimo's neurology, in their capacity for contentment that Lemongrab lacks, in the particular way their consciousness processes experience. Bimo finds joy in simple things, does not require accommodation or support to function, can be happy alone in ways that Lemongrab cannot. This comparison suggests that some wrongness really is wrongness, that some configurations of consciousness really do produce more suffering than others, that the equal treatment of different beings does not produce equal outcomes because the beings themselves are not equal in their capacity for flourishing. This conclusion might seem to support a troubling view, that some beings are simply less capable of happiness than others, that wrongness is real and not just difference, that Lemongrab's suffering reflects something genuinely deficient about him, rather than just the failure of his environment. This view is uncomfortable because it seems to blame the victim, to locate the problem in Lemongrab rather than in the world that failed him. But the show suggests that both things can be true simultaneously. Lemongrab was made with genuine difficulties that would have challenged him in any environment, and the environment he was given made those difficulties much worse than they needed to be. The wrongness is real, and the response to that wrongness was inadequate. The relationship between Lemongrab and Neddy, another of Bubblegum's creations, who functions very differently than the candy people norm, provides additional perspective on how the show treats beings made with unusual configurations. Neddy is deeply anxious, non-verbal, and requires specific environmental conditions to function at all. Yet Bubblegum responds to Neddy very differently than she responds to Lemongrab. She provides Neddy with the environment he needs, maintains connection with him, accepts his differences rather than rejecting him for them. This differential treatment suggests that Bubblegum is capable of caring for unusual creations when she chooses to, that her abandonment of Lemongrab was choice rather than necessity. The question of why Bubblegum cared for Neddy but not Lemongrab is never directly addressed by the show, but possible answers suggest themselves. Neddy does not challenge Bubblegum's authority, does not create problems for her kingdom, does not force her to confront her own limitations as a creator. Lemongrab does all of these things. His wrongness is confrontational in ways that Neddy's is not, demands response, rather than allowing quiet accommodation. Bubblegum's different treatment of these two difficult creations might reflect not their different needs, but her own limitations, her capacity to care for beings who do not challenge her, and her failure with beings who do. The implications of this comparison are troubling for how we think about accommodation and acceptance. If beings are accepted based on how challenging they are, rather than how much they need acceptance, then the most difficult beings, the ones who need support most desperately, will be the ones least likely to receive it. Lemongrab's challenging nature, his inability to be quietly accommodated like Neddy, became the reason for his rejection, the justification for the abandonment that made his condition worse. This pattern repeats in real life, where beings who challenge systems are often rejected by those systems rather than accommodated, punished for their difficulty rather than supported through it. The show's depiction of multiple non-normative creations allows for comparison that illuminates what makes Lemongrab's situation uniquely tragic. Other unusual beings receive support. Other difficult creations are accommodated. Other configurations of consciousness that diverge from the norm are accepted and integrated into community. Lemongrab alone is abandoned, rejected, exiled. His wrongness is not worse than others' wrongness, but the response to his wrongness is uniquely inadequate. This comparison clarifies that his tragedy is not inevitable, not the necessary result of being made wrong, but the specific result of being made wrong and then abandoned. The spectrum of created beings in Adventure Time, from the well-functioning candy people to the uniquely struggling Lemongrab, suggests that creation is a gamble with variable outcomes. Some creations flourish, some struggle, and the difference cannot always be predicted or controlled. Bubblegum creates constantly, and most of her creations work well, but Lemongrab demonstrates that failure is always possible, that consciousness once created must be cared for, regardless of whether it turned out as intended. The ethics of creation require willingness to support all outcomes, not just the successful ones. This understanding has implications for how we think about responsibility in real-world contexts of creation. Parents who have children with disabilities, teachers who work with students who struggle, societies that must integrate members who do not fit easily into existing structures, all face versions of the challenge Bubblegum faces with Lemongrab. The ethical response is not to abandon or reject, but to accommodate and support, to provide what is needed regardless of whether it was anticipated, to stay present to difficulty rather than creating distance from it. The meaning that Lemongrab's story holds for viewers depends partly on what viewers bring to it, on their own experiences of wrongness and rejection and isolation. For viewers who have felt made wrong, who have struggled with neurologies or psychologies that do not fit easily into the world as it is structured, Lemongrab offers recognition, the representation of experiences that are rarely depicted in mainstream media. His suffering is visible in ways that their suffering often is not. His wrongness is externalized in ways that their wrongness usually remains hidden. To see him on screen, even in the comedic framing the show provides, is to see something of themselves reflected back. This recognition can be valuable even when what is recognized is painful. The isolation of feeling different, of struggling where others succeed, of not fitting into spaces designed for other kinds of beings, is compounded by invisibility, by the sense that no one else experiences what you experience, that your struggles are unique evidence of your personal failure. Lemongrab demonstrates that these experiences are not unique, that other beings struggle similarly, that the wrongness you feel is felt by others, even if those others are fictional. This demonstration does not solve the problem, does not make the wrongness go away, but it does reduce the isolation, provides company in the experience, even if the company is imaginary. The show's comedic framing of Lemongrab creates complicated dynamics for viewers who identify with him. On one hand, the comedy provides distance, allows difficult experiences to be approached through laughter rather than direct confrontation, makes bearable what might otherwise be overwhelming. On the other hand, the comedy can feel like mockery, like the show laughing at experiences that are painful rather than funny, like being invited to join in ridicule of someone who represents you. Different viewers navigate this tension differently, some finding the comedy helpful and others finding it harmful, some able to laugh at their own struggles and others feeling wounded by laughter directed at them. The question of whether Lemongrab's representation is helpful or harmful for neurodivergent viewers has no single answer. Representation can be valuable even when imperfect, can provide visibility even when that visibility comes with complications. Lemongrab is not a role model, not an aspirational figure, not someone whose example viewers should follow, but he is present, visible, undeniably there in one of the most successful animated shows of his era. His presence creates space for conversation about neurodivergence, about creation and responsibility, about what we owe beings who are made differently than we expect. These conversations have value regardless of how one assesses the representation itself. For viewers who have not experienced neurodivergence, Lemongrab offers a window into experiences that might otherwise be incomprehensible. His exaggerated suffering makes visible what in real neurodivergent people often remains hidden, externalized what is usually internal, dramatized what is usually managed quietly. This window is imperfect, distorted by the show's comedic framing, but it is a window nonetheless, an opportunity to see something of what it might be like to exist as Lemongrab exists. This seeing does not guarantee understanding or compassion, but it makes them more possible, provides the raw material from which understanding and compassion might be built. The legacy of Lemongrab in popular culture reflects both his comedic surface and his tragic depths. He is remembered primarily as a meme, as a funny scream, as an absurd figure whose extremity makes him entertaining. But he is also remembered by some viewers as something more, as a character who spoke to their experiences, who represented struggles they rarely saw represented, who mattered to them in ways that the comedic surface might not have predicted. This dual legacy is appropriate for a character who is himself dual, both funny and sad, both absurd and profound, both entertainment and something approaching art. The question of whether Lemongrab's representation benefits or harms neurodivergent communities cannot be answered definitively because different members of those communities respond differently. Some find value in his visibility, appreciate seeing their struggles depicted even imperfectly, take from his story what serves them while leaving aside what does not. Others find his comedic framing harmful, feel that the show laughs at experiences that deserve compassion, worry that neurotypical viewers will take away stereotypes rather than understanding. Both responses are valid, reflect genuine engagement with the character, deserve consideration in any assessment of his cultural impact. The evolution of audience response to Lemongrab over time reflects broader cultural shifts in how neurodivergence is understood and represented. Early reception focused primarily on his comedic potential, his meme ability, his entertainment value. Later reception has increasingly engaged with his tragic dimensions, has recognized the neurodivergent coding of his character, has asked harder questions about what his story means and whether it is told well. This evolution mirrors growing awareness and acceptance of neurodivergence. In broader culture, the increasing insistence that neurodivergent experiences be represented with care and complexity rather than simply mined for comedy. The show itself seems to have evolved in its treatment of Lemongrab, moving from primarily comedic early episodes to more complex later ones that grapple seriously with his suffering. This evolution might reflect the writer's growing understanding of what they had created, their recognition that Lemongrab was more than a joke, their willingness to engage with the tragic dimensions their character demanded. Whether this evolution was intentional or emergent, it produced a character arc that rewards serious engagement, that yields meaning beyond entertainment, that speaks to experiences real viewers actually have. For viewers approaching Lemongrab for the first time, particularly viewers who might see themselves in his struggles, some guidance might be helpful. The early episodes play him primarily for comedy and might feel like mockery. The later episodes take him more seriously and might feel more respectful. The overall arc is tragic rather than comedic, even if individual moments remain funny. The show invites complex response rather than simple one, asks viewers to hold both laughter and sympathy, both entertainment and understanding. This complexity is demanding but also rewarding, produces engagement that pure comedy or pure tragedy could not. The conversation that Lemongrab enables about neurodivergence, about creation and responsibility, about what we owe beings who are made differently, has value regardless of one's assessment of the representation itself. He makes these topics visible, creates occasion for discussion, provides shared reference point for exploring questions that matter. Even viewers who find his representation problematic might find value in the conversations he enables, might use criticism of his character as entry point to broader discussions of how neurodivergence should be represented. The representation is not the only thing that matters. The conversation it creates matters too. The broader context of neurodivergent representation in animation provides perspective on where Lemongrab fits within evolving standards and expectations. Animation has increasingly featured neurodivergent characters in recent years, with varying degrees of care and accuracy. Lemongrab predates much of this wave, was created when expectations were different, represents an earlier moment in the ongoing conversation about how difference should be depicted. This historical context does not excuse problems with his representation, but does provide framework for understanding them, for seeing his character as part of an evolving conversation rather than a final statement. The influence of Lemongrab on subsequent animated characters is difficult to measure, but worth considering. His complex treatment of neurodivergence, mixing comedy with tragedy, may have influenced how later creators approach similar characters. His cultural impact, his memorable presence in the popular imagination, may have created space for other difficult characters to exist and be taken seriously. Even imperfect representation can shift possibilities, can demonstrate that audiences will engage with complex depictions, can pave the way for more careful representations to follow. The final assessment of what it means to be made wrong must grapple with the question of whether wrongness is inherent or constructed, whether beings like Lemongrab are genuinely deficient or simply different in ways that a better world would accommodate. The show does not definitively answer this question, and perhaps no definitive answer is possible. What it offers, instead, is the complexity itself, the invitation to sit with questions that resist easy resolution, the demand that we think carefully about creation and responsibility and difference and suffering, without the comfort of simple answers. The argument that wrongness is constructed holds that Lemongrab suffers not because of what he is, but because of how the world responds to what he is. In a different world, one structured differently, his sensitivities and rigidities might not cause suffering, might even be valuable, might fit into contexts where they are needed rather than rejected. This argument has force. Many things we call disabilities are disabilities only relative to particular environments, impairments only in contexts that fail to accommodate them. A different OO, one built with beings like Lemongrab in mind, might be a place where he could flourish. The argument that wrongness is inherent holds that some configurations of consciousness really are harder than others, really do produce more suffering regardless of environment, really represent failures of creation that cannot be entirely remedied through accommodation. Lemongrab's suffering seems to exceed what environment alone could produce. His internal experience appears to be genuinely painful in ways that would persist even in more accommodating contexts. His wrongness is not simply difference, but difficulty, not just divergence, but dysfunction. This argument also has force. Not all difficulties can be accommodated away. Some suffering is built into the structure of certain kinds of consciousness. The truth likely lies in the interaction between these positions. Lemongrab was made with genuine difficulties that would have challenged him in any environment, but the environment he was given made those difficulties catastrophic rather than manageable. A better environment might not have eliminated his wrongness, but might have made it bearable, might have provided the support that allowed him to live with difficulty rather than being destroyed by it. The failure is both constitutional and environmental, both his creation and his context, both what he is and what was done to him. Understanding this dual failure is essential to understanding his tragedy. The implications for how we treat beings who are made wrong, whether through creation or birth, are significant. If wrongness is entirely constructed, then the solution is purely environmental, purely about building better worlds that accommodate different kinds of beings. If wrongness is entirely inherent, then the solution might seem hopeless, a defect that cannot be repaired. But if wrongness is interactive, both constitutional and contextual, then the solution involves both acceptance of genuine difficulty and commitment to providing the support that makes difficulty livable. Lemongrab needed both: acknowledgement that his wrongness was real and commitment to helping him live with it anyway. The show's ultimate message about wrongness might be that it exists, that some beings really are made in ways that make existence harder, and that this reality demands response rather than denial. Pretending that Lemongrab is not different, that his suffering is not real, that adequate accommodation could make him indistinguishable from other beings, would be its own kind of failure, a refusal to see him as he actually is. What he needed was not denial of his difference, but embrace of it, not insistence that he was fine, but acknowledgement that he was not, and commitment to caring for him anyway. This embrace was never provided, and so he suffered not only from his wrongness, but from the loneliness of having that wrongness ignored or rejected. For those who feel made wrong, who struggle with configurations of being that do not fit easily into the world, Lemongrab's story offers both warning and hope. The warning is that wrongness unaddressed, unsupported, isolated, can lead to destruction, can produce the deterioration that Lemongrab experiences, can transform suffering into cruelty that spreads the damage outward. The hope is that this outcome is not inevitable, that different responses to wrongness might produce different results, that beings made wrong can still build meaningful existences if they receive the support they need. Lemongrab did not receive this support. Others might. The question the show leaves us with is not whether Lemongrab deserved better, but what better would have looked like. What does it mean to care well for beings who are made wrong? What accommodations are possible? What support is helpful? What responses to difficulty allow for flourishing rather than deterioration? These questions have no easy answers, but they are the right questions, the ones that Lemongrab's story demands we ask. He was made wrong, and his wrongness was real, and the response to that wrongness was inadequate. We cannot change what happened to him, but we can learn from it, can do better for beings who are made wrong in our own world, can provide the care that he was denied. The final image of Lemongrab is not redemption or transformation, but simple continuation. He exists, still wrong, still struggling, still enduring a consciousness that was made to suffer. This image is uncomfortable but honest, refuses the easy satisfaction of resolution, leaves us with the being as he is rather than as we might wish him to be. Some beings are made wrong and stay wrong, and their existence continues regardless, and something must be done with the time they have. Some meaning must be found or made in lives that were never going to be easy. The meaning that Lemongrab finds or fails to find is left ambiguous. The show does not tell us whether he achieves any peace, any acceptance, any reconciliation with the wrongness that defines him. Perhaps he continues to suffer without relief. Perhaps he finds moments of something like contentment. Perhaps he simply persists, neither happy nor unhappy, just existing because existence is what consciousness does until it stops. The ambiguity is appropriate. We do not get to know how all stories end. We do not get closure for all the beings whose suffering we have witnessed. Some stories simply continue beyond the frame into futures we cannot see. For viewers who feel made wrong, Lemongrab's story is not comfort but company. It does not promise that things will get better, does not suggest that wrongness can be overcome, does not offer the hope that transformation will eventually arrive. What it offers instead is recognition, the acknowledgement that some beings are made with difficulties that may never resolve, and that these beings still matter, still deserve consideration, still have stories worth telling. You are not alone in your wrongness. Others have been made wrong too. The struggle you experience is shared, even if the sharing does not make it easier. The ethics of creation that Lemongrab's story illuminates extend beyond fictional scenarios to real questions about what we owe the beings we bring into existence. Parents, teachers, leaders, anyone who shapes the development of other beings, all face some version of the questions Bubblegum faces with Lemongrab. What do you do when you create something that does not work as intended? How do you respond when your creation suffers? What responsibility do you bear for the ongoing existence of beings you have made? These questions have no easy answers, but ignoring them, abandoning the beings who raise them, is itself an answer, and not a good one. The show's refusal to resolve Lemongrab's story, to give him the redemption or transformation that might satisfy audiences seeking closure, is a final statement about what it means to be made wrong. Wrongness does not always resolve. Some difficulties persist across lifetimes. Some beings never achieve the peace that others find. This is not failure, but reality, not tragedy, but simply the way some existences unfold. To accept this reality is not to give up on beings who are made wrong, but to see them clearly, to offer what help is possible while acknowledging that some problems have no solutions, to stay present to suffering that we cannot fix. Lemongrab screams because the world is too much. The world remains too much. The scream continues. And somewhere in that scream is everything that matters about his story. The suffering that should not have been. The abandonment that made it worse. The wrongness that was real and was never adequately addressed. To hear the scream is to hear all of this, to let it in, to acknowledge what it means. The comedy is real too, but the comedy does not cancel the tragedy. Both are present, both matter, both are part of what Lemongrab is and what his story means. Sleep well.